The day after the State of the Union speech, I reminded a friend at the State Department of my trip and suggested that if the president had been referring to Niger, then his conclusion was not borne out by the facts as I understood them. 6 days after Wilson's account appeared in the New York Times, his wife, Valerie Plame, was outed as a CIA agent.
Ambassador Wilson is the author of the best-selling The Politics of Truth and was a career United States diplomat from 1976 to 1998. He was called by President George Herbert Walker Bush a, quote, true American hero, close quote, for his work on international affairs for over 20 years and was the last American official to see Saddam Hussein before the first Gulf War. And of course, most prominently in February of 2003, he investigated reports of Iraq's attempts to buy enriched uranium from Niger. And when he was surprised that the president repeated a claim he had thought he had debunked in the 2003 State of the Union address, wrote a now famous op-ed in the New York Times saying this was emblematic of the Bush exaggeration, making the argument for our case for invading Iraq, about which I'm sure he will now speak. Please welcome Ambassador Joe Wilson.
Thank you. This is eating into my time. Thank you. Or as I like to say, Bob Novak, eat your heart out. Now, if we get too frisky, I might just say somebody ought to be frog-marched out of the White House again. So I don't want to do that. After all, that, as my wife said, you got a little bit ahead of yourself in that. But I'm delighted to be here. Mark, thank you very much for inviting me to my colleagues, Paul Krugman, who has written so eloquently for so long on this particular subject twice a week in the New York Times. Thank you for your service to American democracy. To Craig, whose book is a real revelation and enhances our understanding of the nature of this relationship. Thank you. And to my friend Sid and his wife Jackie Blumenthal, who have been pillars of strength to Valerie and myself as the latest smear campaign has swirled around us. It has been the Blumenthals who have come to us and have held our hands and have said, remember, one of the things that always happens when it's spinning around you is you have a tendency to forget that you're just innocent. So remember, you are innocent in all this. I thank you. Since I only have 15 minutes about a subject, to talk about a subject where I could wax eloquent live for several hours, I'm going to assume that everybody has read the book and talk really about the chapter that is still being written. In fact, there are two chapters that are still being written. The first one, which I'll talk about today, is the anatomy of a smear campaign. The second one is redemption, and I am absolutely persuaded that we will have redemption in this, thanks to Pat Fitzgerald and others. As some of you who may read the Wall Street Journal and Bill Safire and other right-wing reporters may have noticed at the publication of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report, there was a whole section on the Niger caper. And there were some conclusions that the Senate came to which were simply incorrect. I want to address that. And there were some conclusions in the additional views by the senators, three senators, Mr. Bond, Mr. Hatch, and Mr. Roberts, relating to Valerie and myself. I want to address just two parts of these, and the rest of them I'll address in the Q&A session if I get a question. First is the assertion that the President was correct in making the statement in the State of the Union address in January of 2003 that the British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently attempted to acquire significant quantities of uranium from Africa. Now, as a consequence of that statement being in the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report, I have been branded a liar, and I think some of the ditto heads, including my friend Sean Hannity, a traitor, for having lied and somehow impugned the integrity of the President of the United States for having suggested that he should not have said those 16 words. And yet, if you go back and you look at the body of the report, and regrettably, a rather docile American press decided that they couldn't take the time to read the 7 pages on this particular matter to determine themselves what precisely the Senate had concluded and come up with in terms of information. But if you do that, pages 52 to 59, at least as I downloaded it, of the report, you might in fact see that on October 2nd of 2002, nearly 4 months before the President's State of the Union address, the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence testified to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the same committee that did this report. Now, the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, in testifying to the Senate committee, was speaking as the spokesman for the American intelligence community, offering the corporate view of American intelligence, not whether one analyst was somehow reinforced by Wilson's report, the corporate view of American intelligence, almost 4 months before the State of the Union address. And what he said was, one area where we believe the British have stretched the information is on uranium sales from Africa to Iraq. Now, those of you who don't live in our little world, our little national security world, might want a translation of that sentence. It basically, what he said, representing the American intelligence corporate view, we think the British are full of crap on this one. 4 months before the State of the Union address. 4 days later, the Director of Central Intelligence, again, offering the corporate view of American intelligence, called the Deputy National Security Advisor, and he said to him, we do not want the President to be a witness of fact on this matter because the reporting is weak. Translation, the case has not been made. And because we have told Congress that we believe the British have exaggerated the case. Again, the British are full of crap on this one. The Director of Central Intelligence also sent 2 faxes to the White House, to the National Security Advisor and her deputy on this matter. And yet, 4 months later, the President of the United States used this assertion in his speech. Now, the day after my modest little piece appeared in the New York Times, and I remind people that for all the talk about this, it was 1,500 words entitled, What I Did Not Find in Africa. This was not 7,000 pages of secret documents. In fact, the first attempt to smear me said maybe he was revealing secrets. Let me remind people, nothing. What I did not find in Africa. The day after that article appeared, the White House spokesman came out and he said to the Washington Post, the 16 words did not merit inclusion, did not rise to the level of inclusion in the State of the Union address. A week later, George Tenet testified to the Senate in which he said what I just said earlier. He said to the Senate that, yeah, he did not want the President to be a witness of fact. A couple of days after that, the National Security Advisor and her deputy looked through their files, and they found these 2 faxes and this record of the telephone call. The Deputy National Security Advisor offered his resignation, and the National Security Advisor said, we forgot. And yet, when the Senate Select Committee report comes up with this conclusion, and it's interpreted by people, it's interpreted as, well, Bush was okay. It was right for him to say that. Which basically what they're saying to you is it's okay to outsource American intelligence and analysis to the British, even though the British only spend 5% of what we spend on intelligence, even though the British have very limited assets in Africa. And I served in Africa for 23 years. The first thing a British diplomat does when they circuit ride to countries like Niger, where they have no presence, is drop in to see their American counterpart to find out what the hell's going on. The second assertion, of course, in this report is that somehow my wife had some role to play in my being sent out to Niger. And yet the body of the report establishes my bona fides. In addition to 23 years doing Africa, including at the White House, where I worked intimately with a succession of Niger governments as they worked through 2 military coups and the assassination of a president in order to help them get back to a democratic system of governance. In addition to that, the report says Wilson went out on behalf of the CIA to ask other uranium-related questions in 1999. Those are my bona fides. Now, I would never have told you that. And I'm sorry the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence decided to do so, because in so doing, they burned and compromised a number of my business contacts. And if they could do it to me, they could do it to other Americans who, at the request of their government, go out and try and ferret out information that's important to our understanding of what potential enemies may have in mind for us. And remember, when I took this trip, it was several months. When I took the trip in 2002, it was months before I had ever formulated a position on the war. And indeed, when I did formulate a position on the war, it was based upon a legitimate concern about the threat to our national security posed by weapons of mass destruction. I was asked because I knew something about Niger, a lot about Niger. I was asked because I had undertaken a mission before, and I undertook that mission because nuclear weapons kill Americans. They don't kill just Democrats or Republicans. They would kill Americans if they went off. National security doesn't mean Republican or Democratic security. It means American security. So for these guys to try and paint me as a partisan in this is unfair. For them to, on the one hand, on July 14th of 2003, betray the national security and betray my wife's identity, and a year later try and smear her by suggesting that somehow she was responsible for something that she was not responsible for, is really piling on and a disgrace, and they should be ashamed of themselves. Now again, a docile press. There was an article in the Washington Post that said, that quoted a phrase from my book where I said, she had nothing to do with my trip. Left out of that quote was the beginning of the sentence which said, other than serve as a conduit. Doesn't that change the meaning? Isn't that a professional faux pas, as they say in French? Yes, indeed it is, but that has become the primary source material for everybody else. Nobody's bothered to go back and look at the book, just as nobody's bothered to go and read the text of the Senate report. And as a consequence, my wife's name, which never should have been known to anybody, has been dragged through the mud. Her identity's been betrayed. Her reputation's been besmirched by this, while the person who put the 16 words in the President's State of the Union address remains unknown to anybody. Now, why did they do this? Why did they do this smear campaign? Well, there's a number of reasons. One, I suspect the neoconservatives were not very happy when I wrote about them that they are a parasite loyal only unto themselves who found the Republican Party a willing host. I think Mr. Gillespie was probably unhappy when I suggested and provided the transcripts in my book that suggested he had misrepresented the nature of my contributions to political campaigns. I went back and looked at that, and there's direct quotes. The Wall Street Journal, I'm told, was mad because I was effective. In fact, somebody told me that the real reason they're after you so hard is because you've been effective, which got me thinking that perhaps after this is all done and I have to go out and look for another job, maybe I'll write Fox News, maybe I'll write the Wall Street Journal and ask them for a letter of recommendation on my effectiveness. And then I thought, actually, I've been reading a couple of biographies of Churchill, and one of the things that comes out in each one is the Wall Street Journal opinion page was wrong on World War II. The Wall Street Journal opinion page was wrong on Churchill's speech in Missouri about the Cold War and the Iron Curtain. It's very clear that the Wall Street Journal was wrong about Iraq. They're wrong on Wilson and his wife, so I'm not sure that they would be very good as a reference. But the reason this smear campaign has been run by the Republican National Committee. They have directed this. They have sent, during the height of it, 3 blast faxes out a day. I actually got a couple. The 3 days, this is going to go on another minute or two. The 3 days that we were in Boston, they opened up their press conference by saying, well, we've discredited and trashed Wilson and his wife. Why is anybody listening to him? Now, the head of the Republican Party is the President of the United States, ably assisted by his vice president and by his political advisor. There is a criminal investigation going on involving the White House in the betrayal of the national security of this country. The President of the United States has sought criminal defense counsel. The Vice President has counsel. Mr. Rove has counsel. They have either appeared before the special counsel or they have appeared before the grand jury. I am not a lawyer, but my understanding is that there are ethical considerations surrounding whether or not you are actively engaged in tampering with an ongoing criminal investigation if you might be party to that criminal investigation. And yet they're directing this campaign. And the reason was clear in the Wall Street Journal opinion piece. They want Mr. Fitzgerald to, quote, fold up his tent. Now, there's a second reason for the timing of this, I'm absolutely convinced, is that it was a dress rehearsal for the Swift Boat Veterans Slam. They were able to tweak it. They were able to see how they could manipulate the press, get the facts out, and do this before they came on with the onslaught on John Kerry. But there is a third reason, which is perhaps more ominous. And that reason is to send a signal to the American people. And the signal is as follows. Should a citizen exercise his civic duty to call his government to account for what his government says and does in the name of the American people, as I did, then this administration's response will be to use every political weapon in its arsenal to destroy that citizen and his family. Be afraid, be very, very afraid. Now, that is un-American, it is undemocratic, it is inconsistent with the social contract bequeathed to us by our founding fathers, who said at the very beginning, we must have a healthy suspicion of the power of the executive branch. Hence, we will create co-equal branches of government, and we will endow the press, and we will endow the citizenry with absolute freedoms and responsibilities, essentially, to hold the government to account. And that's what we must do. As I've been traveling around the country over the past several months, a couple of terms keep coming up. One is the whiff of fascism, generally from people who grew up in Central Europe in the 30s, who tell me, beware, you will not know it has happened until it is too late. And secondly is a reference to the McCarthy era from people who grew up a little bit later. Now, the good news about America is that we have a long history of resisting this type, the pendulum swinging this far in one direction. We have resisted before, and we must continue to resist. It is in the nature of our social contract to do so. It is time for somebody to stand up and say, have you no shame? Thank you very much. It's very clear to me that he wanted to go to war with Iraq from the day he assumed the presidency, if not before that. It's very clear that the White House, either directly through his instigation or through the vice president, tried to influence outcomes and influence analyses and conclusions. And it's also clear to me the weapons of mass destruction was just an excuse to do something he wanted to do anyway.